Well, thank you all for taking the time to be here today. We thought we'd take this opportunity. I've been tempted throughout the course of this year with the statistics and the analysis that we've had on violent crime, which really, I would argue, goes back about 18, 19 or so months ago when we started to see a different trend in San Francisco. But I've been tempted to hold similar press avails because I've been enthusiastic about the direction and the progress that has been made in this city as it relates to not only violent crime but property crimes and notably the homicide rate in San Francisco. Suffice it to say, with a few days left in the year, one is tempted to wait until the clock is reset 2010, but nonetheless, we thought this week, as has been the case traditionally, is an appropriate week because these statistics have been holding strong over the course of the calendar year. Homicides in San Francisco are down 54% year to date, 53.6% if you want to be more precise. This is a remarkable reduction. And it's not just a reduction on the basis of a difficult year last year, which it was, but I want to put the homicide rate in perspective. We have been taking a look at our homicide rates going back over the last century in San Francisco. This homicide rate, 45 homicides year to date, not 46. There was one that was deemed a suicide yesterday by the medical examiner after DNA evidence was produced. That homicide rate is about the lowest it's been in half a century, going back to 1961. In fact, in 1961, we had roughly, or in fact, the analysis shows we had specifically 36 homicides. But you'd have to go back close to half a century to find a lower homicide rate in San Francisco. Is that acceptable, 45 homicides? Of course not. Can we do better? I'm absolutely convinced we can do better. Is that solace to the victims? Or is solace to the families that have been victimized by violence? Of course not. And I can only imagine how they're feeling when the mayor announces half-century reduction in homicides. From their perspective, these statistics mean nothing. So I want to caution that I appreciate that point. We all appreciate that point. We know we can do more. We know we can do better. But put that in perspective, the reduction in homicides. There have been hotspots in San Francisco that have traditionally been the most vexing and challenging. Mission, as an example, Bayview, Hunters Point, other parts of our city. In the Mission, there's been a 78% reduction in homicides year to date. A 42% reduction in Bayview, Hunters Point in homicides. Overall, again, 50, I guess we keep rounding it up, but we'll just say 54%. So good news on the homicide fronts. Now, you say, well, that's great, or better than it's been, most assuredly. What about violent crime? The good news, violent crime continues, and I want to remind people that violent crime has not been on an upswing in the last 7 or 8, 9 years. We've been on a steady downswing, but now we're seeing double-digit reductions in violent crime, down 10% year to date, citywide. Which is not, again, insignificant. And that is a number that I expect will get better next year. I have great confidence that Chief Gascon and his new command staff and the rank and file will do even better. And that's not just a challenge in his presence, but it's a real expectation based upon those broader trends. Homicide or robberies down 14%. As examples, and we're going to go through these, and you'll have a wealth of information in just a moment. Auto thefts down 18% year to date. Aggravated assaults down roughly 5%. So those are non-fatal stabbings and non-fatal shootings and the like. Another area that we're pleased, that has been very difficult and challenging, and Chief Gascon will speak to this more specifically in a moment, is clearance rates. A lot has been written, a lot has been stated about clearance rates, particularly for homicides in San Francisco. They are substantially better this year. The numbers are still being calculated or still being aggregated, but we're certainly north of 60%, probably in that 70% range in terms of clearance rates. And again, the chief will speak more specifically about this. So there's been a real effort to focus on the clearance rate. And all these things are interdependent. The clearance rate, in many ways, shapes, and forms, has an impact on subsequent homicides. As you know, many of our identified problems or shooters have been involved in many cases in previous incidences. The effort is not just in terms of the work the police department's done. Though let me state this, the police department has done an extraordinary job, and I'm very proud of this department, and I'm proud of the rank and file and the work that they're doing, and I'm very enthusiastic by the work that the police chief has been doing, and I have great expectations, as I said, that the best is yet to come, that this is not where we will remain over the next year, that we can do better. There's more enthusiasm, there's more engagement, there's better policing than I've seen in years taking place in this city. So I want to thank the police department first and foremost, but I also want to thank our community partners. It's important to remind people, you know, a few years ago we didn't have a violence prevention plan in San Francisco. We hadn't had one for decades. We have one. We have community policing advisory committees. We didn't have that in the past. We have them. We have the use of new technology, shot spotters in 3.3 square miles of the city. We're going to be rolling out to 15 plus square miles in the city next year beyond just the Mission and parts of Bayview. We're going to be rolling it out in the Tenderloin, and we're going to expand its use, the shot spotters use in Portola, or Potrero, excuse me, and other parts of the city. We have engaged in reforms through the PERF reports, and you've got the pilot out in the Ingleside that's taking shape. We met our minimum staffing for the first time in history, 1971. Since 1994, remember, voters set aside that mandate of 1971 police officers. We met that for the first time. We're a little below it now. We hit it, we go down, and we said that the moment we hit that 1971, that this will be a moment in time. We drop, we get above, we drop. It certainly depends on the number of academy classes, number of people that are tridding out, number of people that are retiring, et cetera. But nonetheless, that, as the chief and I were just talking, it was always an arbitrary number, 1971. It made sense perhaps in 1994. But we're satisfied that we're on the right track in terms of personnel. At least I'm satisfied. So a lot of good news to share. After a few very difficult years, particularly in homicides, I think we've turned the corner. I don't want to steal President Obama's phrase, turning the page, but I think in some respects it's a worthy phrase to use. We are turning the page on violent crime in San Francisco and on property crime. And with that, I think a big reason to feel like this is not a moment in time, but this is a trend that can continue, is the gentleman to my left, Police Chief Gascon, who will talk a little bit more specifically, and then introduce a few more speakers that will talk in greater detail.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I think there's reason to celebrate. And as the Mayor indicated, obviously for those families, they have been the victim of a violent crime or they have been a victim of any crime, we want to ensure that they understand that we're concerned. But I think it's time to celebrate the fact that there are significant reductions. The reality is that we have almost 50 people that are walking around today that would not have been walking around a year ago, and that is very significant. We have hundreds of other crimes that did not occur this year that had occurred in prior years, and the impact that has on people's life. You know, whether your car is being stolen or a family member has been shot or your home has been burglarized, to you, that's a 100% increase in crime and the impact that has in your life and the feeling of being violated. And today, we can say that there are hundreds of people that are walking around the city that have not been the victims of crime, and that's very significant. And I think it's an important point to make also that good policing really matters. And the men and women of the San Francisco Police Department are working very hard, and increasingly they're becoming more smart. They're becoming smarter about what they do about crime, and they're working with the community. As the mayor indicated, we're creating community police advisory boards. We're working with business groups. We're working with all the stakeholders in the city to make sure that collectively we can make this the safest city in the country, and that is the goal here, is to make San Francisco the safest large city in the country. I believe that we can do so. The makeup of the city, this is a smart city, this is a wonderful city, and there's no reason why we should not be the safest city. We have some problems. We're continually dealing with our technological capabilities in order to come up with better numbers. As the mayor's indicated, We know that clearance rate in homicide has increased significantly, definitely at least 60%, probably more. The numbers we're still working on the numbers. We have glitches, we have issues that we have to deal, but we know that this is a significant improvement. You will see us as we move into 2010, a continuous improvement of the way that we capture data, the way that we analyze data. I welcome the mayor's challenge, and believe me, we will come up mid-January of this year, of 2010, I'm sorry, and we'll come up with the goals for the year. And there will be stretch goals, because I believe in stretch goals. I think that the police department can deliver a better service. We have good people, we have a great community, and I believe that you will see the reduction of crime to continue, and also the effectiveness and the work that we work with our community to improve in 2010. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to turn it over very quickly to our police commissioner, David Onick. He's going to say a few words, and we'll have Assistant Chief Cashman, who is a director of our operations, go into details of some of the crime reductions.
Thank you, Chief Gascon, Mayor Newsom. On behalf of the Police Commission, I just want to say how pleased we are with the numbers this year. It is a significant improvement, and I think it's really due to the hard work of the men and women out on the streets working for the San Francisco Police Department, who have done a phenomenal job. I also think the leadership of Chief Gascon coming in and the leadership earlier of former Chief Fong earlier in the year combined have really made this a stellar year for the department. I particularly want to talk about the violence reduction plan that was spearheaded by Assistant Chief Cashman, who you'll be hearing from in a moment, and Deputy Chief Murphy, has made a real impact. I also want to reiterate what the mayor said about our community partners. You know, when the homicide rate goes up, the police department tends to get too much blame, and when it goes down, likewise, the police department should not get all the credit. There are some terrific community partners in the city. Our commission president, Joe Marshall, at the Omega Boys Club, I happened to be at their family meeting the other night, listening to the young men and women there who have turned their lives around. There's no question in my mind that programs like Omega Boys Club and others like it in the city are reducing violence, just like the men and women on our streets are reducing violence. You also heard talk of the community advisory groups, which I think is a real innovation. I had the opportunity to be out in Ingleside for a community advisory group meeting recently. You have community leaders sitting around with the captain and other department officials problem solving together about what the problems in the community are. And that is going to be moving to all of our districts, and I think that is going to be a real key to community involvement going forward. So the last thing I want to say, also reiterating the earlier remarks, is, you know, we can't get complacent. We're very pleased with the progress made this year, but there's still a lot of work to be done. When you get complacent in this business, bad things can happen very quickly. Policing does make a difference. I think we're showing that. And one thing I don't think anyone will ever say about Chief Gascon is that he's complacent. So we really do have very high expectations for the coming year. We had very high expectations for Chief Gascon coming in. He has exceeded those expectations so far, and we look forward to continued progress going forward. I'll turn it back to the Chief then to turn to some of the members of the department.
Thank you, Commissioner, Chief, Mr. Mayor, members of our community. I'd just like to take this opportunity to really reach out and thank the rank and file of the San Francisco Police Department for really being out there on a daily and nightly basis. And they've done a tremendous job, especially over the last 2 years when it comes to violence reduction. Additionally, I'd like to thank the outside agencies that have been of incredible support to the San Francisco Police Department, you know, specifically the CHP, the FBI, DEA, ATF. I know I'm going to forget someone, but the outside agency support has been tremendous over the last 2 years. And it's really been incredible value to us. I'd also like to thank Dr. Anthony Barraga. He came out in 2006 and did some real intelligence-based research onto our violent crime patterns, specifically homicides and gang-related shootings. And what we gleaned from that was that a limited number of people are responsible for most of 45 to 50% of the violent crime in San Francisco. Additionally, that study told us that approximately 2% of San Francisco geography is where most of the violent crime is occurring. So armed with that data, we constructed a violence reduction plan based on how to more effectively deploy our resources. And we published that plan, I want to say it was in February of 2008. So not without some risk-taking to the department. We were out there on that one. It did pay huge dividends because of a coordinated response involving all aspects of the police department, from investigations to patrol to gang task force to every single component. Everybody contributed equally and to the nth degree. So we're very happy with the dedication of resources. And the result, here we are, you know, a few years later with a significant reduction in homicides, non-fatal shooting, as well as other crime throughout the city. So I will say, with respect to the clearance rate, because the there was a significantly less or decrease, I should say, in the number of homicides. It did give our homicide inspectors the ability to really reach out and do more effective and thorough investigations into the 45 homicides that did occur. Consequently, we have a significantly higher clearance rate at this time. So, the premise behind Dr. Braga's research was one basic principle, and that was if it's predictable, it's preventable. And I think the San Francisco Police Department has made a huge contribution toward, reducing the predictable, therefore preventable homicides. Thank you.
Just, Deputy Chief, if I can grab this, just underscore the non-fatal shootings. This is the number, and you've heard me say this over the years, that I particularly am focused on. The homicides, of course, are significant, but in many ways it's a quirk of fate. It's an act of God. That someone gets shot 3 or 4 times and survives versus someone that barely is scraped and then develops a blood clot and passes away. So the non-fatal shooting numbers, I think, are very, very telling. And I want to just underscore that, again, this trend is a trend that is not unique to this calendar year. We've been seeing it over the last 18, 20-ish months. To underscore that, in the last two, and I'll premise this more specifically, from January 1st to December 16th, and again, we're waiting for the final 2 weeks year-end data. Going back 2007, 2009, you've seen the non-fatal shooting, the number of citywide victims decline by 36%, and the number of incidents declined by 41%. So that's also very telling. Homicides down 54%, non-fatal shootings over, again, a much longer period of time, not just 12 months, down 36 and 41%. Respectfully. So very good news to share, appropriate that we do share it. A lot of energy, a lot of work has been done, but you know this, and it was stated when we all stood here and our new police chief was sworn in. Our singular goal is to be the safest big city in the United States of America, period, exclamation point. We still have work to do to get there, but I think now finally we're well on our way, and with that we're happy to answer questions.
Several of you spoke about the homicide clearance rates, and the only statistic on the news release that actually goes down to a fraction, 73.3% homicide clearance. Yep. Because it's a fraction, it tends to indicate, real specific, and then you're all throwing these numbers out like 60, maybe closer to 70.
That was, that number is still being worked out, but that's the preliminary estimate, and candidly, we probably should have waited to put that on there, but that's the preliminary estimate.
They're estimates, accurate. Look, they're accurate. Yeah. All of them but that one?
53.6%. Very specific. So that's it. That number can change in the next few weeks. So that's a preliminary number.
Do you think it's closer to 60 or closer to 70?
The chief can explain, and there's a reason why we have that number. We wanted to. But we'll go through.
Here's the thing with homicide clearance rates. You have multiple factors working. Obviously, you have the factor of how well the investigators are working the crimes. They're also reporting guidelines that are established at the national level. They're part of the uniform crime reporting process. And sometimes in the past, the San Francisco Police Department has not adhered to those rules as closely as they should. Not because of an intentional act, but just basically the lack of knowledge and possibly some level of negligence. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that we adhere to those rules very closely. The problem that we have is we can ensure that we're adhering to the rules today. It's more problematic as we start going back in order to determine whether the rules were properly adhered to. And the comparison has to be in the context of what happened before against what happened today. So that's what we're being we want to make sure that we're careful in comparisons of as against prior years or even earlier this year. Having said that, there is no question that our clearance rate in homicides is going to exceed 60%, and more than likely it will be very close to that 70, possibly the 73%. But it's more nuanced than that, and we just want to make sure that we're right on the money when we put out the final numbers.
Have you seen any areas increase?
Increase in crime, particular types of crime within any part of the city. You know what? I don't have. Does anybody have the year today? You have that.
There are a few, I mean, the remarkable thing is, there are areas in specific districts that have gone up marginally, but substantial. I mean, for example, violent crimes down 10% citywide, it's down 19% in the Bayview. In almost every statistical category, we've seen a reduction in crime. There's been a little bit of increase in some property crimes.
Yes. For instance, if we look at burglaries, and let's take the Southern Station, year-to-date burglaries are up in Southern Station by 10%. Burglary theft from vehicle at Southern, they're up 2%. And if we go around, you know, one of the things, again, if you recall, and I have said this over and over again. In fact, I said this radio interviews and many other areas. We're trying to tighten up our reporting systems. We're trying to make sure that we're very accurate in our reports. We believe, I should say actually we believe, we know that crime is down year to date. We know that we're heading in the right direction. We have certain barometer types of crimes that are very accurate. Homicides are a very accurate number. Vehicle theft are very accurate. And those generally have a tendency to tell us what else is going on. We know that shootings are very accurate also, you know, when people are being taken to the hospital. So we can tell that most of our numbers are heading in the right direction. But as we're cleaning up our numbers, actually, if you were to look at some of these numbers that I'm telling that we're up today, if you were to look at them several months ago, you would have seen a reduction, and we have gone back and cleaned up some of these numbers, and we'll continue to do so. One of the things that we're going to do in 2010, as we very closely adhere to the national guidelines in reporting, is that we're actually going to be fighting, and sometimes we're going to be fighting good numbers against bad numbers, and that's going to be, it's going to make it more difficult for us to have a crime reduction. But having said that, the fact that we're still showing crime reductions as we clean up our numbers is very significant.
Chief, the Ninth Circuit Court recently ruled that, you know, in order to taser a suspect, that suspect has to be deemed dangerous. I mean, how does that affect your department and moving forward on taser policy?
Yeah, well, of course, you all know that we do not have the taser today, but actually, and I'm not familiar with all the fact patterns in this case, but I have looked at the basic ruling, and it's a ruling that I would agree with. It follows a policy that I implemented in the city of Mesa when I went there, and it follows very closely with the policy that the LAPD has today, and it would be the type of policy that we would put here in place if we get police commission approval. The taser should only be used when you have someone that is aggressive, combative, and is likely to cause you or others serious injury, and they're not using a firearm. Putting that to the side, we have conducted a 90-day study about the use of force. This study is going to be presented to the Police Commission with some recommendations. I think it's important to recognize that the taser is not a non-lethal tool. It is a less lethal tool. I know that Amnesty International, for instance, talks about 320 or 300 plus people that have died as a result of the use of taser in the last 8 or 10 years. My response to that is that yes, some people will die as a result of the use of taser. Many more people die as a result of the use of a firearm. The taser is a humane way to deal with people that are very aggressive and they're trying to hurt other people or police officers. Having said that, there are times when you have medical conditions that are impacting an individual, and the taser could be a contributor factor in causing death. Nevertheless, it's still a much better tool than beating someone with a stick or having to shoot someone.
Mayor, I just wondered if maybe the two of you could answer this about crime cameras and the fact that, you know, they're not monitored sort of in real time. Oh, yeah. Have they had any positive effect at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's mixed. I mean, in terms of homicides and violent crime, you can argue that they've not necessarily, but in terms of property crimes, in terms of just general feeling safety by community residents, they absolutely have, and that's why you haven't seen any of them removed, because the community doesn't want to see them removed. There's 71 crime cameras at 16 locations. The chief, when he came in, not only during the process of the interview, during our discussions, our first few weeks and our subsequent discussions, he and I are looking at monitoring as a possibility in a few specific locations, and we'll be announcing some of our ideas very, very shortly.
Initially were opposed to that.
Yeah, and that's why we've been talking a lot, and I've been listening to his perspective on this, and to the extent that there are community support and it's strong support for a limited version of monitoring, then I'm open to that. And the chief has some very specific ideas, and we'll be announcing that at a subsequent time.
If we get the chief to weigh in on the do you think they should be monitored, or the way they are now? I mean,
right. Well, as the mayor indicated, this is an evolutionary process. San Francisco has come from not having any cameras to having cameras that were not real-time monitored in the city. The airport is a different story. The airport, we have about 1,700 cameras. We monitor in real time. We know that we catch people committing crimes in the airport. We prosecute people. Frankly, we're able to provide the footage to both the defense and the prosecution in this case, and generally cases settle very quickly. So there is a time and a place for real-time monitoring, but I agree with the mayor. This is a process that we're still working on. It has to be a thoughtful process. We want to make sure that we're very mindful of people's privacy and people's civil rights, and we want to make sure that when we hit it right on the spot for San Francisco.
Mayor, your Office of Criminal Justice has gone through quite a bit of change in the last 2 years. Some with grant writing ability, you've lost a director, a police officer that used to be a liaison. Are you going to continue staffing that office?
Yes. Yes.
Forward, you have a new director you have?
I have be making an announcement very shortly.
Can you elaborate on what other reasons you attribute to this decline in crime? Is it increased enforcement? I mean, does the gang injunction play into any of this? What are other than the neighborhood relationships and the violence prevention plan, what else led to this?
I think that in San Francisco, you have to really look at what the police has done. Violent crime has been going down nationwide for the last 10 years. Significantly, homicides were going down in most other major parts of the country 5 years ago. San Francisco was not the case. So some of the things that altered the DNA in San Francisco was the focusing of resources on those places where most of the crime was occurring. I think that it's important also to give credit to community organizations and community members have also worked with the police department. So, when you're talking about crime, there are many factors going on all the time. Sometimes we know what's causing a reduction or increase. Sometimes we're not sure. People predicted that the recession would cause crime to go up. I try to remind people that during the Depression, actually we had some of the lowest crime levels in the country. So I'm not so sure that the economy is necessarily an indicator of crime going up or down. There are many factors. Certainly when it comes to homicide, medical care can have a tremendous impact, and that's why I think it was so important. The mayor purposely talked about the shootings, because the shootings are not impacted by medical care. People either get shot or they don't, but sometimes medical care can turn a potential homicide into not being one. So there are many factors that are at play, but I think that unquestionably the work of the men and women of the San Francisco Police Department this year in focusing on the right places at the right time, as well as those communities and how they have worked with the police department, has had a significant impact.
Yeah, and I think we initiated about 2 years ago, a little less, a zone strategy, and really focused our resources aggressively in saturating key areas of San Francisco. Back to the Deputy Chief's point about a very small percentage of San Francisco in terms of its landmass where the violence was occurring. So it was just common sense, really, that drove some of the policing efforts. And it was the organized efforts by all of us here at City Hall to really step up some of our community-based partnerships. And I think it's a combination of both smarter policing and community-based support. And I just think you hit a tipping point in a city where people are just fed up and they've had enough. And we had strong support now. The DA's office really stepped up, strong partnerships with the CHP and the FBI, and a combination of new technology, and now with a robust CompStat management strategy and real accountability down to the districts. I expect these trends to continue.
The small percentage of people who are responsible for crimes, small areas that are responsible, are these gangs that we're talking about? I mean, is it gang violence that where the crackdown has really occurred?
Yeah.
Specifically, some are involved in gangs. The research from Dr. Braga indicated that there were people with significant criminal histories. They were no stranger to the criminal justice system, if you will. A lot of them averaged over 10 prior felony arrests. These are both victims and witnesses. So the people who were engaged in the criminal justice system were, like I say, victims and suspects. And so we did focus on those individuals intensely.
Okay, so just some of them are gang members? Or?
Some were gang members, and I think that was a big part of it. I did have a copy of the violence reduction plan from about 20 months ago, and it did talk about strict enforcement of court orders, specifically the gang injunctions. That was a big part of it. The other part was intensive and sustained narcotics enforcement for open-air drug dealing. We see a lot of problems associated with that. Additional emphasis was on fugitive apprehension. When somebody bench warrants on Monday, we want them in custody on Tuesday before they reoffend, victimize somebody, or become victims themselves. We also put a lot of resources into parole and probation compliance checks. So it was a multifaceted approach, but there's a lot more to it. So I'd be happy to answer questions later.
Any other questions?
Witnesses was, getting witnesses forward is always been a problem. Is that
Always a challenge. I mean, as you know, we've increased the rewards in some cases, 100,000. A few select cases, almost $250,000, which is extraordinary. I'm not convinced increasing the rewards has necessarily worked, but you can ask the district attorney. I think she's had more cooperation in the community over the last few years. That's why I said we hit a tipping point where the community says enough's enough, and I think that's substantively what is the big change. Is people just had enough. And the community started stepping up, faith-based leaders, community-based organizations, friends and neighbors, parents, caregivers, the efforts, again, police department. It's a combination of all these things. I think we must have initiated 20 or 30 specific things over the course of the last few years, and you hit a point where these things start taking shape and start really paying off. Now we have the added benefit again. I think the most significant change will be this, the notion of putting the cops, so to speak, on the dots and the CompStat modeling and the accountability and really driving that down to the district level. That gives me, again, great hope and confidence that we'll meet these stretch goals that the chief talked about coming into the new calendar year. Thank you all.